For months since the Odyssey's announcement and subsequent casting choices, we've seen an endless amount of people giving their perspectives on the movie and the decisions that have been made by its directors and producers.
Actually were, then guess what? You don't actually care about the story. You don't actually care about the characters. You don't even care about the message. The only thing these people care about is erasing other people's cultures and replacing it with their own, and then crying victim and hiding behind the shield of racism. I'm sorry, it's not racist to point out that this is not right, that this is...
I think the very idea that this Greek story would have depicted Helen of Troy as black is absolutely 100% ridiculous. It's the complete and total opposite of that. And we see the same thing that we see each and every time.
And once again, this is their attempt on falsifying history. Falsifying history to say, if we shout enough that these people were lily white, yeah, then we're not going to get any pushback. But I'm sorry, you're going to get pushback. You're definitely going to get pushback from here, because history, literary history, anthropology does not agree with your lily whiteness of ancient Greece. You guys have been subtly trying to whiteify Greece over the past few decades.
The idea was also explored in a book called Black Athena. I think people should read it, which argues that classical Greek culture is heavily indebted to Afro-Asiatic and Near Eastern roots. I actually taught Greek mythology to 8th graders. And so I covered this. So people that are saying that Helen of Troy could not possibly be played by a black woman don't know history.
But what does it matter?
Let me present to you Helen of Detroit.
But the first question that should be asked is, how many of these people who are complaining about Helen of Troy being cast as a black African woman, or Achilles being played by a transvestite, or any other so-called woke narrative that seemingly is in this movie, have actually read the Odyssey or any of the ancient classical pieces of Greek literature that are in relation to its story? My guess would be not that many, seeing as though a character like Helen of Troy, who plays a very small and rather insignificant role in the overall narrative of the Odyssey, appearing maybe once or twice throughout the entire narrative, is being so heavily focused on and talked about in regards to who she is played by, when there are other characters, such as Pallas Athena, or simply just Athena, who is also being played by a black woman, in Zendaya, has not received anywhere near the same level of criticism as the actress who will be playing Helen of Troy, Lupita Nyong'o, has received, despite Athena being a far more significant figure in both of Homer's most famous works known as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and being the prime mover of events in both ancient poems. Even such characters as Eurylochus, who is being played by British Indian actor Himesh Patel, who is once again a far more significant figure in the overall plot of the Odyssey, being Odysseus's second in command while he and his crew try to find their way home back to Ithaca after the events of the Trojan War have unfolded, have not received the criticism that the casting choice for Helen of Troy has received. So if we are going to cry woke, DEI, and race swapping because of Helen of Troy's casting decision, then the same should be said for other characters that are not white and Greek, right? But the simple reason for why these things have not been emphasized, at least from my perspective, is due to the fact that people are riding the wave of outrage and vitriol, rather than actually trying to educate themselves about the story they are trying to act so passionate about. But when one truly delves into the actual facts and the source material and of history itself, they may not like what they find. This is especially true with a story like the Odyssey, and the question that a lot of people don't seem to be too concerned with is, how were these characters described? I believe the presumption of, well, they are Greek, they come from Greece, a European country that can still be seen as occupied by Europeans, speaking an ancient Indo-European language and being depicted in statues and artwork from their time as European in appearance, is the wrong one to have when one understands that ancient populations did not look the exact same as we see them today, and that ancient peoples thought of the concepts of race differently than how we do today in our modern society. Batone must ask themselves, as it pertains specifically to a story like the Odyssey, do people truly know how a lot of the characters that are featured in this epic poem written over 2,000 years ago by the legendary poet Homer were described? Most importantly, though, do Do people even know how Odysseus, the character who the entire epic poem known as the Odyssey is about, looked like according to Homer's own description of him? There have been many translations of the Odyssey over the years, from the famous ancient Greco-Roman writer Livius Andronicus of the 3rd century BCE, to the 18th century English poet Alexander Pope, to the ever-so-famous 1961 translation, which is considered by many to be the greatest Odyssey translation of all time written by Robert Fitzgerald, all the way down to today, where our most popular and recent translations made by Robert Fagles and Emily Wilson of our time period are read by millions all over the world. But of course, almost none of these renditions of the original poem written by Homer over 2,000 years ago are written in the archaic Greek language he spoke. So we are left to rely on their translations if we are only to read them in English. But what does the original archaic Greek say about the appearance of the main character of the Odyssey, and how can we be sure that it has in fact been translated correctly by its translators over the years? Well, there is hardly a better way to find this out than to look at the original language ourselves and see what Odysseus actually looked like. Alright, so to start this study off, we will read an essay that was authored by a highly renowned Greek classicist who was, and I believe still is, the A.G. Leventis Professor and Regius Professor of Greek Culture, two of the highest honors of professorship in Greek classicism that anyone can achieve in the world. He teaches at one of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the world, Cambridge University, which is also regarded as one of the top universities in the world for Greek classical studies. He is a scholar, professor, and author by the name of Tim Whitmarsh, and in this essay, which was conducted in May of 2018, he addresses what was a very fervent controversy at the time, very similar to the present controversy at hand regarding the movie that will be released worldwide on July 17th about the Christopher Nolan live-action rendition of the Odyssey. This particular essay Mr. Whitmarsh wrote a little over 8 years ago in reference to the controversial casting choices of a Netflix and BBC-produced show by the name of Troy, Fall of a City, a show which focused on the story of the Iliad, the predecessor to the Odyssey's narrative, and illustrated the events that happened before the Odyssey's main character, Odysseus, was thrust into the perilous treks and journeys he would be forced to have to endure in his story. And in this show, much like Nolan's Odyssey, there were some controversial, to put it mildly, casting decisions that were made which saw various different characters who were so-called black being cast in roles that, according to the vast majority of public consensus, should have been cast as Caucasian Europeans, preferably from the country of Greece. In this essay, Professor Whitmarsh addresses mainly the controversial decision that was made by the producers of this show to cast the ever-famous warrior of Homeric legend, Achilles, as a black man. We won't get into the comments he makes about Achilles as of yet, but what we will take a look at is his commentary on perhaps the second most famous Homeric hero, the main subject of this video, Odysseus. And to do that, we will go down to the paragraph of this essay that says, let's take another example and read the first 2 sentences. Let's take another example, which will come as a surprise to those whose mental image of Homeric Greeks is marble white. In the Odyssey, Athena is said to enhance Odysseus's appearance magically. He became black-skinned, melachrois again, and the hairs became blue, quanii, around his chin. On 2 other occasions when she beautifies him, she is said to make his hair woolly, similar in color to the hyacinth flower. Here we see Mr. Whitmarsh ascribes to Odysseus, according to his translations of Homer's words, for both his skin color and hair, the physical traits of having black skin, which he provides the original Greek word melachrois, and also woolly hair. Now, as the title of this section entails, we will only focus on the word that was used to describe the hair of Odysseus at the moment. So keeping in mind the understanding of Odysseus's hair, according to highly renowned Greek classicist scholar Tim Whitmarsh being described as woolly, we have to understand where he derives this translation from. Since, unlike with the word blackskin, he does not provide the original Greek term that was used to describe Odysseus's hair when he was being cleansed from the filth that he had been in, since the goddesses Athena had disguised him to look like a lowly stowaway beggar in Book 13 of the story, so that no one, especially the suitors who were looking to marry his wife Penelope, during his 20-year absence from his household in the land of Ithaca. According to the story, in Book 23 of the Odyssey, Odysseus's wife, who he had been estranged from for the already mentioned length of time of 20 years, Penelope, had gained knowledge that Odysseus had returned from the wet nurse who delivered him at birth, Euryclea. Penelope did not believe her, nor would she believe Odysseus even when she laid eyes on him. All she saw was the same stowaway beggar she had befriended in previous books, who was clothed in tatters and filthy. And so Odysseus devised a plan to go and have himself bathed and clothed in new clothes so that his wife Penelope could finally see that it was indeed him who had returned and killed all the suitors that tried to take his wife's hand in marriage. After he was bathed and given fresh clothes to wear, Homer lets us know that Odysseus was, as the text says, crowned with beauty from head to foot, and was also made taller and more muscular, and was given his curls back again after previously stripping them away from him in Book 13 in order for him to be disguised as previously mentioned. However, the word that we have to focus on in order to put together the first piece of constructing how Odysseus looked is the word that describes the hair texture he was adorned with from Athena. The Greek term that Tim Whitmarsh translates as woolly, which when one evaluates a person who is characterized as having woolly hair, you would think of them as being negroid in appearance. This is a belief that was even evoked by the ancient authors of antiquity, such as the Greek geographer and historian of the 1st century BC Strabo, who stated in his Geographica that the Ethiopians were a people of black complexion and woolly hair. The Ethiopians, who most modern scholars would refer to as sub-Saharan African populations, inhabited the southern portion of Egypt, eastward of the Nile River. Greco-Roman writer of the 2nd century CE Claudius Ptolemy stated in his I Tetrabiblos that the Ethiopians had thick and curly hair, which would be just another way to describe someone with a woolly hair texture. And the Greek historian of the 2nd century CE Arrian states in his Indica that the Ethiopians were woolly-haired. So Ethiopians, who can pretty much uniformly be classified as a black or negroid population, were described having a woolly hair texture. So this is clearly the hair texture of a person could classify as black today, and this is once again the hair texture that is ascribed to Odysseus according to Tim Whitmarsh. This will obviously raise some questions as to whether or not this is the correct translation of the word to describe the hair of Odysseus. So in order to answer this question, let's take a look at what exact word was used to describe Odysseus's hair in the original Greek language. And actually, before we get to the original Greek text, let's look at the English translation first to act as a backdrop for the original text in the archaic Greek language. So reading from the website Perseus Tufts, which is one of the earliest known digital libraries of classical literature, we will be focusing on the excerpt from Book 23, line 155, where the number 155 is in the bracket here. And we'll actually start where the text says, Meanwhile, the housewife Eurynome bathed the great-hearted Odysseus in his house, and anointed him with oil, and cast about him a fair cloak and a tunic. And over his head Athena shed abundant beauty, making him taller to look upon and mightier. And from his head she made locks to flow in curls like the hyacinth flower. So in the English translation we see that Odysseus's hair is described as being made curly by Athena, who is trying to restore Odysseus to what he looked like more naturally before she changed his appearance in Book 13 to disguise him from the rest of the people in Ithaca. The operative term that's used to describe Odysseus's change of hair is that it became curly, or as the text says, she made locks to flow in curls. A simple enough explanation, but the question begs to be asked is, did the type of curly hair Odysseus was restored with resemble this type of curly hair, which is characteristic of the hair type a lot of Greek men have today, or did it maybe look like something else? Well, let's look at the original Greek text to see what kind of curly hair was meant to be implied. One of the features this website gives you is the ability to look at the original Greek text along with the English translation, so we will do that right now. Here is the original Greek text, and what we're going to do is look at the essential words that will help us understand what Homer was trying to illustrate when describing Odysseus's hair. The first Greek word we'll look at is the word komos, which is shown right here, and we can see Perseus Tufts defines this word to mean literally hair of the head. But then a second definition underneath this one which says to let the hair grow long. And this is important to look at because if we look back to the English translation, it states Athena made the locks of Odysseus's hair to flow in curls, which if the English translation is in fact correct would illustrate to somebody that the curly hair that Odysseus is being bestowed with here would possibly look like the flowing curls of a modern-day Greek male who has long curly hair. But This word for hair here simply just seems to illustrate that the hair Odysseus is being restored with is growing long, once again, as opposed to how his hair would look after Athena changed his appearance and quite literally, as the text says, depending on what translation you read, stripped or destroyed the curls from his head so that the curls he once had he no longer had. So Athena restoring his original curly hair texture and it growing long once more is just meant to indicate that his hair was growing again and became longer than what it was before Athena took it away. This is further affirmed by the imagery that is given of the hair of his head blossoming, as the original Greek word anthos entails, like a hyacinth flower, and also by the word kata, which means to go downwards, so we can surmise that Homer was trying to illustrate how the hair of Odysseus was growing down from his head once again, as opposed to what it was previously after Athena changed it. So, this does not necessarily indicate him having the long flowing hair of a modern-day Greek, but just that his hair has grown again and is becoming longer than what it previously was. So now that we have that established, we can go about looking at the actual word that was used to describe the type of hair Odysseus had, and when we go to the Greek word that has been rendered as this, as well as most translations, we can see that this term is not simply translated as curly, but woolly or fleecy. This Greek term is pronounced oulos or oulos, and in its current context and form, this would seem to be the word that describes Odysseus's hair. This is consistent with the already more than reliable source of Tim Whitmarsh, who stated in his essay that Athena did in fact make the hair of Odysseus as woolly and like that of the hyacinth flower. We can even take a look at another very well-known translation written by late 19th century English novelist and critic Samuel Butler's translation, who translated the names of the characters in the Odyssey to the English language, Boutin, the form of how the later Roman writers would pronounce the names of the figures in Homer's poems. But in Butler's translation, we can see that he uses the same Greek term for the hair texture that was restored back to Odysseus. The Greek term oulos, and we have seen Tim Whitmarsh's translation of this word as well as the translation Perseus, Tufts gives us, in which both of them translate the Greek word oulos to mean woolly or fleecy, or as Whitmarsh translates it, woolly-haired. But let's look at a few other examples from different sources to see if the translation of this word holds up. This is a translation of the Iliad written by the highly renowned British scholar of mainly Greek classical literature by the name of Walter Leaf. And for years, his translation of the Iliad was regarded as the best and foremost English translation of the epic poem, and Walter Leaf himself was regarded as one of the foremost Homeric scholars of his generation, so he should be a pretty reliable source of Greek terms that were used in Homeric poems. And so when we take a look at his translation of the term that was used to describe the hair texture of Odysseus, oulos, we see that he equates this term with the word woolly, remaining consistent with the other translations from two already very reliable sources on the Greek language. Let's look at another one. This is yet another translation of the famous epic poem that preceded the Odyssey, translated by another scholar of Greek classical studies from the late 19th century, early 20th century, John Robert Sitlington Sterrett, who in his day was a professor of classical studies at the highly prestigious Ivy League institution of Cornell University. He confirms once again the definition for the Greek word oulos being the term to mean woolly, fleecy, woolen, and thick. In Samuel Butler's translation, he also uses the term thick to illustrate the hair texture of Odysseus, so this translation maintains consistency with that one. But we see yet another highly renowned Greek scholarly source help us to understand that Odysseus did in fact have a woolly hair texture, which most modern scholars and even relatively recent older scholars will try to simply just translate as curly, not specifying the type of curly hair that is meant to be implied by the Greek word oulos, which is clearly a type of curly hair that is more tightly curled, which is what would be implied by the term woolly hair, and we'll delve more into that in a little bit. But let's see a couple more definitions for aulos, just to confirm that this ancient Greek term quite literally does come out to mean woolly when the term is broken down. Here is yet another Homer's Iliad translator by the name of Alan Rogers Benner, who was a late 19th century, early to mid-20th century Greek classical scholar and not to mention professor at Phillips Academy in Andover. Here he defines oulos again to mean woolly and fleecy. Another very highly renowned scholar of the late 19th to late 20th century scholar by the name of Herbert Weir Smith states in his work, which compiles ancient Greek poems and the terms that were used in these pieces of literature, that oulos, once again, simply comes out to mean woolly, so the operative term in Greek used to describe Odysseus's hair texture almost uniformly comes out to mean woolly. We've looked at highly renowned scholarly accounts on Greek classical literature who are more than reputable when translating Greek terms from ancient Greek epic poems. But let's revisit what this term woolly hair means exactly, just so we can get a firm understanding of what is being said here. The definition of woolly hair, although today being in my opinion used in a derogatorial way, since most definitions you'll find state that it is a hair disorder rather than an actual hair type. But even so, the most common definition of woolly hair you'll find is summed up very well according to the website Grokopedia.com. Woolly hair is a rare congenital abnormality of the scalp hair structure, characterized by tightly coiled kinky. Ignoring the absurd assertion that the term woolly hair is some rare abnormality of a disease, we can see the definition of woolly hair being a hair texture that is tightly coiled, or kinky. So in other words, a type of hair texture that would resemble what we call type 4 hair, which of course is most commonly found in populations that can be identified as negroid in appearance. And this surely seemed to be the understanding that the ancient authors of Greece and even later Greco-Roman writers themselves had in regards to how they described populations of people we would no doubt describe as so-called blacks or Negroes. The 2nd century Greco-Roman author Claudius Ptolemy described the Ethiopians as such. They are consequently black in complexion and have thick and curled hair. We see here that Claudius Ptolemy describes the Ethiopians as having curled hair, which of course indicates the tightly curled, coily hair one would associate with a person with so-called negroid physical traits. This shows that curly hair, or curled hair, as it is oftentimes translated in the Odyssey when describing the natural hair texture of Odysseus, cannot not simply be translated as the type of loosely curled hair one would see if a modern-day Greek male were to have this type of hair texture. And if we are to take the exact definition of the word that was rendered curly for Odysseus's hair, the Greek word aulos, as the term that was used to describe his hair, then Odysseus's hair would have been along the lines of the tightly coiled hair that was seen in so-called black populations like the Ethiopians. There were other ancient Greek writers who spoke about the appearance of the Ethiopians in detail, one of them being the famous geographer and historian of the 1st century BC Strabo, who stated in his Geographica concerning the physical appearance of the Ethiopians. Now in this he is correct, but no longer so when he lays the black complexion and woolly hair of the Ethiopians on merely the water and censures Theodectes. So we see Strabo attributing a woolly hair texture to the Ethiopians, who most will not argue were a negroid people. And we can go into the original language of Strabo writings here and see that in the original Greek text, Strabo uses the term olothrix, which Perseus Tufts here defines as crisp curling hair. We can look at perhaps the most used and well-known Latin and Greek lexicographic dictionary, the Liddell, Scott, Jones Ancient Greek Lexicon, which defines the term olothrix as with crisp curly hair like Negroes, and it also cites Strabo's exact quote from his Geographica. We can see the root word ulos in this word, combined with the Greek term thrix for hair, which makes it come out to mean woolly-haired in the English translation that was shown previously. So, with this term ulos being the main word that gives this Greek term its meaning of crisp, curly hair like that of a Negro, we can see that ulos was in fact a term that indicates the tightly curled or crisped hair of a person with negroid, or what some people might call afro-textured hair. A similar term was used by the 2nd century CE Greek historian by the name of Arrian, who compiled a work known as Indica, which documented his treks and journeys through the Indus Valley to the Persian Gulf. In this work, he once again refers to the Ethiopians as woolly-haired, but he uses a slightly different term to describe the Ethiopians, seeing as though his version of Greek was Koine Greek and Strabo's Classical Greek, an older form of the Greek dialect than what Arrian spoke. But the same word can be seen at the heart of Arrian's term for woolly hair, which is olokranos. Olokranos, according to the same dictionary we used for Strabo, means essentially the same thing, crisp curling hair, obviously implying the hair of a so-called black person. And just for good measure, I'll throw in Aristotle's 2 cents on the appearance of the hair of the Ethiopians, written in his Generations of Animals, where he states that the Ethiopians in fact had what is translated as curly hair, due to the dry climate they resided in. And as we can see, curly hair is the English translation for the Ethiopians' hair, which we should be able to say with a level of certainty was implying a tight curly type of hair, like what would be characteristic of a black African population to have, and I believe that is important to keep in mind because it acts as an example for how Odysseus having his hair texture described as curly is a translation that does not necessarily mean he had the curly hair texture one would expect a modern Mediterranean person to have, but rather, as should be obvious by the Greek word that was used to describe his hair, he in fact had tightly coiled curly hair, or as the Greek word olos would define it, woolly hair. So, now that we've seen how Odysseus' hair was described, let's look at another defining mark of Odysseus' physical appearance as it was described by Homer in the Odyssey, and this description is a bit more telling of how Homer would have seen Odysseus, since it describes the outright skin pigmentation he had. For this description, we can go to Book 16 of the Odyssey on the Perseus Tufts website, and starting where the text says, "With this Athena." With this, Athena touched him with her golden wand, a well-washed cloak and a tunic she first of all cast about his breast, and she increased his stature and his youthful bloom. 5. Once more he grew dark of color, and his cheeks filled out, and dark grew the beard about his chin. So now the operative term here should obviously be connected to his skin color being described. The sentence states that he grew dark. Of color, obviously the word we need to scrutinize is dark, and we can do that by using the very useful feature Perseus Tufts offers its users with, that allows us to see the original Greek translation alongside the English translation. When we go to the word that was translated dark in this paragraph, we see the original Greek word melankrois. What Perseus Tufts also provides us with, of course, is a definition for the word that is given in the original Greek language, and we see that Perseus Tufts defines this term as black-skinned and swarthy. Now let's just take a look back at the Tim Whitmarsh essay, because this translation is right in line with his, where he translates this description in Book 16, line 175 for Odysseus as, "He became black-skinned, melakrois, again, and the hairs became blue, quinei, around his chin." On 2 other occasions when she beautifies him, she is said to make his hair woolly, similar in color to the hyacinth flower. Not only does he translate the exact word, melankrois, the same as Perseus Tufts does, but his translation makes it more plain that this was his original skin color before it was most likely altered by Athena back in Book 13. In Book 13 it describes how Athena took away the natural skin color of Odysseus, stating, "She withered the fair flesh on his supple limbs, and also, about all his limbs she put the skin of an aged old man." So Odysseus's skin pigmentation was clearly altered after Athena changed his appearance to disguise him. So in this scene, in Book 16, he is given back his original skin color, and when this is restored to him, it states he was a black-skinned man. Now first we need to establish even further what the exact definition of this Greek adjective melankrois is, because even though Perseus Tufts tells us what the definition is, and so far it's proven itself to be a pretty reliable source of translation, it's good to get confirmation. So let's take a look at a few Greek dictionary definitions for melankrois. This is a Greek-English dictionary written by a 19th century German author and translator by the name of Gottlieb Christian Crucius, and he defines this term melankrois as of a black color, having dark skin, and he also cites the very same line from the Odyssey this word is found at. Here is another Greek-English lexicon dictionary written by the British historian and classicist Charles Duke Yonge. In his dictionary, he gives the entry term black, and then when we go down and look closely, we'll see the term melankrois, again as it is written out in Greek characters, but interestingly enough beside it we can see the word complexion in parenthesis. This obviously is meant to imply that the term melankrois, which means black since it is listed under the term black, is in reference to a black complexion, which is another way of saying black-skinned. So from this definition we can still see that black skin color is what's implied by the term melankrois. And if it's not too much to look at another translation of this line from another highly renowned classics scholar by the name of Leah Himmelhoek, who received an education of Greek and Roman cultural studies from Yale, and subsequently after that, her master's and PhD at the University of Texas in Austin. This right here is a presentation that I assume was written by her, but at the very least this work cites her as the sole translator of the Greek that is written out on this page. But we see here the title of this work suggests that the author wants to inform their readers on the context behind many of the skin color terms that were used in ancient Greece and what was implied behind them. And this will kind of lead into the second half of the rest of this video, where later on when I'm done talking about Odysseus, we will take a look at perhaps the most talked figure in this whole Odyssey controversy. But in dealing with this, first, I want to read some of this work so two things can be established. For number one, obviously we need to confirm even further that Odysseus was in fact described as black-skinned according to the word melanchrois that was used for his skin color. But I would also like to highlight the meaning behind terms like black or dark when they were used in reference to a Greek male's skin color during the archaic period in Greece's history, because it will give us an insight into the reason for why a black skin color would have been the ideal way in which a character like him would have looked like. But let's read this first entry from this work here before we get to the translation, and we'll start where it says, "The gods favor the Ethiopians. The gods favor the Ethiopians, shining burnt-faced men, i.e., dark-skinned men, and still consort with them, though they no longer do so with the rest of mortals." The author then cites different passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey, where the gods were seen showing a high level of regard for these Ethiopians. The author cites Book 1, line 423-425 of the Iliad, which states, "For Zeus set out yesterday for the river ocean to feast with the worthy Ethiopians, and all the gods followed with him." The author also cites Book 23, lines 205-207 of the Iliad, which state, "Iris, the messenger of the gods, tells the winds that she must depart to be honored by the Ethiopians to the land of the Ethiopians, where they are making a splendid sacrifice of 100 oxen for the immortal gods. There indeed will I have my share of the sacrificial feast." The author cites one last line, this time from the Odyssey, which comes from Book 1, lines 21-25, which state, "But he, Poseidon, had gone to visit the Ethiopians so very far away, who were divided into two groups dwelling in the most remote regions of men, one group where Hyperion, god of the sun, sets, the other where he rises. Poseidon went there to receive a splendid sacrifice of hundreds of bulls and rams. There he was sitting and taking delight in the feast." So we see multiple instances cited by this author of when the gods went amongst the Ethiopians, and this was an occurrence that is never mentioned with any other race, where the gods showed reverence and favor to an entire people, not even amongst the Greeks, although individuals such as Odysseus, Diomedes Hector of Troy, Paris, Achilles, in the Iliad, received favor from the gods. But the Greeks as a whole never received the level of favor bestowed upon the Ethiopians described here in these excerpts from both poems. So why did the gods admire the Ethiopians this much would be the underlying question that needs to be answered. Well, the author seems to think that one of the main reasons for this reverence from the gods to the Ethiopians is due to their dark skin being associated with divinity. The author in a paragraph down below illustrates their opinion on why ancient Greek writers like Homer and even the great historian Herodotus, who stated in his histories that the Ethiopians were physically beautiful, or a contemporary writer to Homer from 8th century Greece by the name of Hesiod, who nicknamed the Ethiopians the high-souled Ethiopians, revered the Ethiopians so much to the point where they associated them with divinity. The author has this to say on the matter. "The earth was a flat disk. So the rising sun came up from beneath the disk to the east, then set by dropping below it to the west. People living near these two regions, the path of the sun, were special, supernaturally touched." Again, Ethiopian means burnt, blazing face, since Greeks, though their dark skin came from sun exposure. Thus, Ethiopians' dark skin marked their proximity to the divine. So the author's opinion is that the Ethiopians received favor from the gods because their dark skin indicated being supernatural or divine, because it came from their close proximity to the sun. If you're familiar with Greek literature, you'll know that the Ethiopians were said to have been burnt by the god of the sun Helios, which is how they received their dark or black skin. Now, am I of the opinion that this is in fact true and that the ancient Greeks looked at the Ethiopians as divine or favorable to the gods because of their skin color? Possibly it could be true, but one thing that is for certain is the fact that ancient Greeks looked at dark skin pigmentation as favorable, especially for men. The author of this work makes one more comment on how dark skin was perceived in ancient Greece, at the very bottom under the heading Dark Skin in Homer. And this is where we will get our next translation of Odysseus' skin color. And again, this translation comes from a reputable source of Greek literature, Leah Himmelhoch. But before we read her translation of Book 16, line 172-176 of the Odyssey, I just want to read the sentence before so it can act as some context to the statements I just made. So let's read this first sentence. Dark skin was considered masculine. Pale skin was feminine. The darker his skin, the more beautiful, masculine, and martially skilled a man was. So dark skin was a mark of masculinity and beauty to the ancient Greeks, according to the author of this work. Which would make sense of why Homer, when he envisioned what the personage of Odysseus would look like, envisioned him to be a dark but really black-skinned man. The author confirms this through their translation of his physical appearance. They state, in Odyssey 16:172-6, to help Odysseus defeat the suitors, Athena restores him to his youthful prime, making him Melancreis, 175, black-skinned, dark-skinned. This adjective's first half melas, black, dark, is the root for our word melanin. So we see once again that Odysseus's skin color was described by another scholar as black-skinned, and it remains consistent with that first description given to us by Tim Whitmarsh earlier on in the video. So it should be clear that this was, in fact, how Odysseus was described. But what deserves to be delved into a bit more here is this high regard the ancient Greeks had for dark skin pigmentation and its association with masculinity. This was something that was also stated in one of the previously mentioned Greek dictionaries, the Little, Scott, Jones' Ancient Greek Lexicon, where in their dictionary they have this to say about the definition of melancrois through the root word this adjective comes from, which is melanchrou, and it reads like this: black-skinned, swarthy, of sunburnt persons, also of a hero's complexion. So not only is melancrois associated with the term for black-skinned and even the word swarthy, but it also gives us a bit of context behind the underlying meaning of someone who was black, dark, or swarthy-skinned. It states that a person, mainly a man, who had this complexion was looked at as having a hero's complexion. And it cites none other than the same line from the Odyssey Book 16 pertaining to the skin color of Odysseus. So it's clear that this would be the ideal skin color for someone like Odysseus, who was seen as a great warrior, a great tactician, and ultimately a great hero of his own tale. So this had to be the actual skin color that Odysseus had, and to back this up we can take a look at the great ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who gave in his work Republic a very interesting statement about the different dichotomies that existed between the different skin tones of people at the time and how they were viewed through the eyes of the ancient Greeks. And some of the statements he makes pertaining to how a person with a certain skin tone was looked at in ancient Greece are quite malleable, but I'll explain why I say that in a minute. But let's just read what he says on the face of it. The swarthy are of manly aspect, the white are children of the gods divinely fair, and as for honey-hued, do you suppose the very word is anything but the euphemistic invention of some lover who can feel no distaste for sallowness when it accompanies the blooming time of youth? Now again, some of the terms he uses in this excerpt from his Republic are very malleable or subject to be interchanged depending on who is being described. For example, Plato is implying here that the honey-hued, or as the official translation states this term means in the original Greek, the olive complexion, are the ones whose complexions personify the blooming time of youth. And the Greek word that is used for this term, honey-hued, is actually a very closely related term to the Greek term we've been looking at this entire time, melancrois. This Greek word is pronounced melikloros, and as we can see here, it means honey-hued, or olive-complexioned. Now this is a good example for what the point I'm trying to get across is, because when we go back to Book 16 of the Odyssey and take a look at how it describes Odysseus being changed by Athena, it states while his skin was beginning to be changed back to its original color, Athena increased his stature and his youthful bloom. And following after that, we see that he is made dark, or black-skinned again, and so Homer uses the term for black skin to indicate Odysseus's bloom or complexion of youth coming back to him. But Plato uses the term for a person of honey or olive-hued to indicate someone's youthful complexion. And since melancrois and melikloros are similar but different terms with totally different meanings, it can't obviously be talking about the same thing, so in this instance, Homer is stating that a person's youthful bloom is when they are black-skinned, not olive or honey-hued. But at the same time, he remains consistent with the statement Plato makes where he says at the very beginning the swarthy are of a manly aspect. This was best evoked by John Linton Myers, who was a late 19th century to early 20th century British scholar and archaeologist, who was a Gladstone professor of Greek at the University of Liverpool for a brief time, and in this work of his he has this to say about what it meant for Athena to change Odysseus back to his original black skin color. Only once is a hero described as dark-haired, and that is on the occasion when Athena's divine magic destroyed, then restored the manly beauty of Odysseus, but whereas he was Xanthous before the double change, he becomes dark-skinned, after it with a blue and black beard. So we see the manly beauty of Odysseus was restored through his skin color being restored back to its original dark but really black hue. And just going back to how this remains consistent with Plato, when we look at the translation for swarthy, the original Greek word translates as melos, which is considered the standard Greek for the color black. So essentially, Plato is stating that the ones who are black or swarthy of skin are considered manly. So this would make sense of why Odysseus was, as the aforementioned John Linton Myers states, restored to his manly beauty by being turned black-skinned. The senior lecturer in classics and ancient history at the University of Exeter, Emily Hauser, echoes this sentiment in her work entitled Penelope's Bones, A New History of Homer's World Through the Women Written Out of It, echoes this sentiment, that Odysseus's black skin was a signifier of masculinity amongst the people of ancient Greece, stating, when in the Odyssey, Athena transforms Odysseus back from his beggar disguise, he became black-skinned, melachrois. Again, Homer writes, and beard hairs grew blue, quenny eye on his chin. So we see Emily Hauser, yet another reliable authority on the matter of Greek classical studies, states that Odysseus was in fact described as black-skinned. We've seen this translation confirmed over and over again thus far, which should make it obvious by now that this is just how he was described. But we can go down a bit here and see that she affirms that dark, or really black skin was the ideal skin color of masculinity in ancient Greece. She states, and did he have black skin? Maybe or maybe, if we look beyond modern concepts of racial color, which don't map onto ancient ways of thinking. Homer is writing in gendered terms instead, using the normative color split between white women and dark men that we've already seen in wall paintings to underline Odysseus's virile masculinity. Now, although I agree with Emily Hauser's stance here, to a degree, and we will be revisiting what she says here later on in the video, but although I agree, there is still a certain level of room to presume that Odysseus's actual literal physical appearance was what is being described by Homer, and that, as the first scholar we read from, Tim Whitmarsh, stated, he was in fact a black-skinned and woolly-haired man. This description Homer gives of Odysseus echoes how other groups of people were described by ancient Greek authors in antiquity. Herodotus is probably the most famous one of the bunch to use this term to describe a group of people known as the Colchians, who were a people that resided along the Black Sea region in Eastern Europe, and who Herodotus claimed descended from a people we know of today as the Egyptians. He expresses in his work The Histories how he was of the opinion that the Colchians were descended from the Egyptians because they were black-skinned and had woolly hair. Now, this is one of the more controversial ancient descriptions, mainly because it implies that the ancient Egyptians had features that were consistent with that of a so-called black African. And we won't get into that conversation at the moment, because that is something to be saved for another day. But what we can do is break down the Greek words that were used to describe the Colchians and the Egyptians. The Greek word used to describe the Colchians and Egyptians' skin color is malagros, which if we go to the online dictionary, academic dictionaries and encyclopedias, it states malagros means black-skinned, swarthy, and sunburnt persons. So black-skinned can be seen as the primary definition of this word that was used to describe the Colchians and Egyptians. This is a word that is heavily related to the term that was used to describe Odysseus as a black-skinned person as well. So we also have that level of synchronicity too. Looking at another dictionary, this being an academic dictionary of classic literature that was produced by the prestigious Harvard University in 1978, we can see that they cite the translations of a very common dictionary we have used all throughout this video thus far, which is the Liddell and Scott Dictionary of Words Used in Classical Literature. They state that Liddell and Scott translate the exact word used to describe the Colchians and Egyptians as black-skinned. This excerpt even cites two other classical Greek scholars who translate the words used to describe the Egyptians and Colchians variously as swarthy and then again black-skinned. Down near the footnote section, which gives a citation of these two sources, it states that two, most likely, professors of classical studies from Cambridge and Oxford were the ones who provided these translations. So these are two definitely reliable sources for this translation, although I don't think a question of unreliability needs to be asked when we are looking at something from Harvard University. But nevertheless, we see that the Colchians and Egyptians were in fact described as black-skinned. But now back to the other part of the description Herodotus gives, where he states that they were woolly-haired. The Greek word that is used for woolly-haired here is aulothrix, which comes from the Greek word oulos we looked at earlier. And it is unquestionably talking about the same tight curly hair that is associated with afro-textured hair, so there's no need to really question that. So again, this is not an ancient Egyptians were black video. That's another topic I'll cover again another day, but it is clear here that from these Greek terms Herodotus used to describe the Colchians and subsequently the ancient Egyptians, he was stating they looked like so-called black people, as we would call them today. A close contemporary to Herodotus, who was a Greek tragedian poet of the 5th century BC by the name of Aeschylus, also held the understanding that during his time period, the ancient Egyptians were people with, as he stated, black limbs. So it's clear the ancient Egyptians during these ancient scholars' time period had to have looked quite a bit negroid, and even though they wrote their accounts of the ancient Egyptians' appearance after the native population of Egypt had already been taken out of power for good by the Persians, we can still see a semblance of what they looked like by looking at some of the artifacts that still exist of the last native Egyptian dynasty that persisted a little bit before Herodotus and Aeschylus' time period. We can see from looking at some of these artifacts that the ancient Egyptians, even of this time, did in fact have the black or very dark skin and woolly hair texture of a negroid-looking people, along with the other facial features one would associate with this type of ethnicity. So it's safe to say that the Colchians and ancient Egyptians were described as having black skin and woolly hair because they were in fact so-called black people. And of course, we already know of the Ethiopians, who were also described as black-skinned and woolly-haired by ancient Greek writers that we've already gone over, such as Strabo, Arrian, and Aristotle, who described the Ethiopians as curly-haired, which was just another way of saying that they were woolly-haired. And also Claudius Ptolemy, the Greco-Roman scholar of the 2nd century AD, stated that the Ethiopians were black in complexion and had thick, curly hair. So the physical traits of having a black complexion and woolly hair should not only be looked at as literal, but also markers of someone who looks like what we would associate today with a so-called black person. So with that being the case, it should be clear that Odysseus was in fact described by Homer as a so-called black man. Now let me just say this for the ones who will see this video and say, oh, is he saying that Odysseus was a quote-unquote sub-Saharan African or a black African? That can't be possible. He was a Greek Achaean, not a black African. Let me make this as clear as possible. Just because Odysseus was described in a way that is clearly consistent with that of a so-called black man, that does not mean I am asserting he was African. The Greeks went out of their way to distinguish themselves from the people they considered black Africans. As in the great philosopher Aristotle's Opscola, he states too black a hue marks the coward, as witness Egyptians and Ethiopians, and also too white a complexion, as you may see in women. So the hue that makes for courage must be intermediate between these two extremes. A tawny color indicates a bold spirit, as in lions. Now first we can see that Aristotle links up the Ethiopians and Egyptians together, calling them a people who had too black of a hue, which just confirms my statements earlier, which was that the Egyptians were described with traits associated with a black African-looking people. But we also see that Aristotle considered a tawny complexion to be the complexion of courage, and this seems to echo his teacher, Plato's sentiment of the swarthy or black being of a manly aspect. Now obviously Aristotle does not use the word swarthy here, but rather tawny, which indicates a brown color of varying shades, from light to dark brown, and this is the complexion that most likely was meant when describing Odysseus, not as dark, as an Ethiopian or an Egyptian, although he could have been, but most likely still a dark-skinned man that could be consistent with the skin color of a so-called black person. As we know, so-called blacks come in various different shades, not just deep dark brown like how the Nubians oftentimes were portrayed by the ancient populations who depicted them. and this term tawny encapsulates that definition, because the ancients thought of this word tawny to mean a brown color that was anywhere from being black to a yellowish brown. The term tawny was used by 1st century BC Roman poet Lucretius in his work De Rerum Natura to describe the complexion of what he called a black-skinned girl. Now, obviously, he is writing in the Latin language as opposed to the Greek language Aristotle and other ancient Greek writers used, but it still gives us an understanding of the nuance ancient writers looked at a color like tawny with. But Greek writers used the word tawny to describe anything from the varying shades of yellow-brown fur a lion has, as in the case of Euripides in his Alcestis. And Euripides, by the way, lived during a time where there was a type of lion that existed in Europe known as the Asiatic lion, whose color could range from a reddish-brown to grayish-brown color. From that to Euripides again using the word tawny but to describe the color bees in his Iphigenia in Tauri, who we know to be either a yellow-brown to yellow color. Tawny could encapsulate all of these shades. So what Aristotle is stating here, when he makes his clear distinction between the Greeks' skin color being in the middle of others' complexions, which can be deemed as too black or too white, is that the ideal complexion was that of a person who was very dark-skinned to lighter brown-skinned, but not completely dark or black like an Ethiopian or an Egyptian, but also not pale white. So Odysseus was not a black African, but he also did not look like the typical modern-day Mediterranean European man. Aristotle himself dissociates the ideal skin color with this kind of olive-skinned complexion by stating later on in the next sentence, "The honey pale are cold, and coldness means immobility, and an immobile body means slowness." This is the type of skin tone that could be associated with the so-called olive complexion of modern-day Greeks. And even facial reconstructions that show notable ancient Greek figures in history, such as Aristotle, Zeno, Socrates, and even Homer himself, depict them with this olive skin tone. But as we know, Odysseus was not in fact described with this kind of complexion, as Homer elected to describe him as melanchrois, which, as we've already seen, means black-skinned. If Homer did think of him to be the olive-skinned man that most modern-day people might associate him looking like, then the word Plato uses in his Republic to describe this kind of complexion, which is heavily related to the word used. For Odysseus, the Greek word melikloros would have been what was used. So Odysseus was in fact a so-called black man, but I am not claiming him being one and the same with people like the Ethiopians or other sub-Saharan African races. He was most certainly a Greek, an Achaean as Homer would call the Greek, heroes of his stories, and there were other Achaeans as well as other Greeks, as well as other characters in Homer's works that were described in the same way Odysseus was. One such character was once again an Achaean, which was a term that was used to describe one of the 4 main Greek tribes that were living in Greece post the Bronze Age collapse of 1177, which firmly placed the people who formerly occupied Greece prior to these 4 tribes coming in and taking over Greece and its various islands and land masses, the Mycenaeans, out from the position of power and influence they formerly had. This particular character is a very minor one, only briefly mentioned in the Odyssey maybe once or twice, but he nonetheless had a close enough tie to Odysseus that allowed him to be mentioned in this epic poem of Homer. This character's name was Euripides, and he, like Odysseus, was from the Greek island of Ithaca and served Odysseus as his herald, which was a person who made announcements and delivered messages on the behalf of their overlord. Euripides was also Odysseus's squire and accompanied him on journeys. And even though Euripides was a minor character in Homer's poems, he's unique in the sense that he was described in a pretty much identical way to Odysseus. The website Grokopedia writes it out best. Euripides was a herald and trusted companion of Odysseus in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, valued for his physical resemblance to his master and their aligned intellects. So Euripides was valued for his physical resemblance to Odysseus, and that idea of physical resemblance between Euripides and Odysseus is given in the second paragraph below this one, where the description of him given in the Odyssey is quoted, which is that he was round-shouldered, dark-skinned, with woolly hair. And this obviously echoes the description of Odysseus, who was of course also described as dark but really black-skinned, with woolly hair. But as we've done throughout this video, we're going to confirm that Euripides was actually described in this way as it is written out on Grokopedia. By doing what was done with Odysseus, which is of course looking at the original Greek language to see what specific words would have been used by Homer to describe him. We'll go back to the Perseus Tufts website and see the translation first in English. This is book 19 of the Odyssey, and the description of Euripides can be found around line 245, right around where it says, "Furthermore, a herald attended him." So that is the line we will start out reading. "Furthermore, a herald attended him, a little older than he, and I will tell thee of him too, what manner of man he was. He was round-shouldered, dark of skin, and curly-haired, and his name was Eurybates, and Odysseus honored him above his other comrades because he was like-minded with himself." So we see the description of Eurybates as dark of skin and curly-haired, and a quick comment I want to make on this quote is the fact that the translator of this rendition of the Odyssey translates Eurybates' skin color as dark and his hair as curly. And this is oftentimes what a lot of these translators will do. They will intentionally play down the original meaning of these words used to describe essential figures or even entire groups of people when those people are described in a certain way that may not fit the translator's narrative. In other words, a lot of translators of the Odyssey and other classical works of ancient literature will try to make a certain word in the original Greek language mean something else from how it was originally intended to mean, which is where you get authors like the two most well-known recent translators of the Odyssey and Iliad and other works of classic Greek literature, Robert Fagles and Emily Wilson, who will translate Odysseus's description from Book 16 that we read from earlier absurdly as him being changed by Athena to have a ruddy tan and curly hair, in the case of Robert Fagles' translation. In Emily Wilson's translation, she simply states Odysseus was tanned and again had curly hair when Athena changed him. But as we should know, the words that were used to describe Odysseus were not ruddy tan or tanned with simply curly hair. At the very least, he was described as dark, but really and truly he was described as black-skinned with woolly hair. That is what the original Greek words that were meant to describe him meant. There's very little, if any, room to deny that. But in order to keep up the narrative that a certain group of people in the ancient world looked the exact same as the people living in that particular part of the world today, and are allegedly their descendants, they have to twist these words around in order to make the figures from ancient times sound similar in appearance to the very same people who claim descent from them, which in my opinion, can act as further confirmation that figures like Odysseus, and now as we talk about him, Eurybates, were not described by Homer as looking like what we would think a modern person from Greece looking like. If he did intend to describe them in that way, then why would there need to be this manipulation of terms that were used to describe Odysseus and now his herald Eurybates? The word that is rendered dark skin for Eurybates in Book 19 of the Odyssey is of a similar relation to the word that was used to describe Odysseus's skin color in Book 16. The word that is used for Eurybates is the Greek term melanocrous, which, as we can see here, Perseus Tufts lets us know that this term means dark-skinned and black. The word that is used to describe Eurybates' hair is aulokarinos, which comes out to mean with crisp, curling hair. Now I want to address this word first, because the definition Perseus Tufts gives here does come out to be curly-haired. But let's look into the etymology of this term. First, by looking at the Little, Scott, Jones' Ancient Greek Lexicon, which defines aulokarinos the same way Perseus Tufts does, with crisp, curling hair, but when we look at the root word it gives at the top of the definition, we see the very familiar term that was used for Odysseus' hair when it was changed in Book 23. The Greek word aulos is where the term aulokarinos comes from, and as the definition states, aulos means, it is defined to mean woolly. Other references, such as the English classical scholar of the early 20th century William Walter Mary, in his work on the Odyssey, defines the term aulokarinos as thick woolly with hair curling on his head. So this is obviously meant to indicate that the type of curly hair being spoken about in the poems was the tight curly hair that is associated with woolly hair. Another classical scholar of the works of Homer, this time the Iliad, from Princeton University by the name of G.M. Edwards, defines the term aulokarinos once more as woolly-headed. So aulokarinos, being a term that derives from the literal Greek word for woolly, aulos, can safely be said to mean woolly-headed or woolly-haired, which is why most translations of his physical appearance will attribute him with woolly hair. Peter W. Rose, a professor of classics at Miami University, Ohio, also translates Eurybates' description as him being round-shouldered, dark-skinned, and woolly-haired. The Hellenist and associate professor of language and linguistics at the University of Texas at El Paso, Bruce Loudon, who actually authored his own translation of the Odyssey, translates Euripides' hair as woolly as well, describing him as rounded in his shoulders, dark-skinned and woolly-headed. So even though the proper translation for Euripides' hair type would be woolly, it can still accurately be translated as curly. But understanding what kind of curly hair he had is important. Much like with Odysseus, Euripides would have had the same tight curly coiled hair that is associated with woolly hair, and this is perhaps not explained any better than by the 18th century English poet and dramatist, who before Robert Fitzgerald, produced his classic translation of the Odyssey in 1961 that has become the standard translation for any scholar of Homer's works who want to make their own translation of the Odyssey. This poet, by the name of Alexander Pope, produced probably the greatest English translation of the Odyssey that had ever been made, and by some, his translation may still be looked at as the greatest one that still can be looked at as the standard translation for Homer's famous work. And in his translation, he describes Euripides differently from how most modern English translators will render his physical description. In his version, he describes Euripides as such: his visage solemn, sad of sable hue, short woolly curls o'er fleeced his bending head, o'er which a promontory shoulder spread. Euripides, in whose large soul alone Ulysses viewed an image of his own. So Alexander Pope, using his own poetic skills and language, illustrates for us that not only did Euripides have, as he says, short woolly curls, which, from everything we've seen thus far, with all the translations and dictionary definitions of the word for woolly that was used to describe Odysseus and his herald, is a more than accurate translation for the original Greek word that was used to describe Euripides' hair type. But he also lets us know that Euripides was of a sable hue. The term sable in Alexander Pope's time period meant simply black, or at the least dark brown in color. We can look at dictionaries that were made during his time period to confirm this, dictionaries such as the Samuel Johnson Dictionary from 1768, which states that sable simply just meant black. From the Webster Dictionary of the 1800s, sable is once more defined as black from another dictionary authored in 1730 by English lexicographer Nathan Bailey. Sable again means black. And one last one is a dictionary from 1708 that was authored by John Kersey, another English lexicographer, who defines the color sable first as a color between black and brown, which would be a dark brown type of shade. But then he later on states that sable is also black as well, so it's more than fair to state that Alexander Pope, one of the great poets and writers of the 17th, 18th centuries, used the term sable for Euripides' skin color because he translated the Greek word that describes Euripides as black, which confirms what we've already read from the translation given by Perseus Tufts. So now that we've seen both Odysseus and Euripides' physical descriptions, we can conclude that Odysseus, being described as an Achaean or Greek who was black-skinned and woolly-haired, was not just a one-off thing. His herald, who was also an Achaean, was also described as a black-skinned and woolly-haired man, and Euripides was stated to have come from Ithaca, just like Odysseus. So the Greeks of this time period were definitely capable of having features and physical traits that would be considered Negroid. But these two were not the only Achaeans who this physical description was given to by Homer. There was another Achaean who participated in the Trojan War and played a very small role in the overall narrative of the story, mainly acting as an antagonizing force for the other Achaeans, especially Agamemnon, who in Book 2 of the Iliad had made the decision to sail back home after having fought in the famous Trojan War for 9 years at that point. For of course the retrieval of the famous symbol of beauty we will talk about in a minute here, but Thersites acts as a kind of insulting figure towards Agamemnon and is documented being hated by many of the Achaean soldiers and nobles that were participating in the Trojan War. Nevertheless, Thersites was an Achaean soldier, and he was described by Homer in a way that lets us know that the ancient Greeks during this time period had the capability of having what would be known as so-called black or Negroid physical traits. But let's read Homer's exact words and how he described Thersites, and I'm going to read from this translation of the Iliad, from one of the more well-known translators of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, especially in our modern time period, who to some arguably produced the best English translation of the Iliad, and was the very well-known American translator, poet, and academic and teacher of classical studies at the prestigious Princeton University, Robert Fagles. So let's read how he translated the description of Achaean soldier Thersites. The armies took their seats, marshaled into ranks. But one man, Thersites, still railed on non-stop. His head was full of obscenities, teeming with rant, all for no good reason, insubordinate, baiting the kings. Anything to provoke some laughter from the troops. Here was the ugliest man who ever came to Troy. Bandy-legged he was, with one foot clubbed, both shoulders humped together, curving over his caved-in chest and bobbing above them, his skull warped to a point, sprouting clumps of scraggly woolly hair. So we should know woolly hair by now is a physical trait that was associated with so-called blacks, making Thersites another Achaean, a so-called black person. But now that we've seen how other figures besides Odysseus were described, let's take a look at a few other Homeric characters and how they were described. For this portion of the video, though, the descriptions I'll be showing shouldn't be taken as absolutely accurate as the descriptions that come straight from Homer's own words in the Odyssey, since for number one, these descriptions were not given by Homer himself, but rather by two authors who wrote works inspired by Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. But at a much later time than when Homer would have written the Iliad. As a matter of fact, these works were actually written during medieval time period, around the 5th to 6th centuries, which would have been about over 1,000 years after Homer's famous authorship of the Iliad. But secondly, the descriptions of each character are not consistent between the two authors, as you'll have some characters like Paris of Troy, for example, who is described allegedly as blonde-haired by one author, who was supposedly the Trojan priest of Hephaestus, Dares the Phrygian, who actually was very briefly mentioned in the Iliad along with his sons Idaeus and Phegeus. Although the Iliad-inspired work is written in his name, the work has been ascribed to Cornelius Nepos, a Roman author of the 3rd century AD, but most scholars have ascribed it to later on, probably around the 5th century AD, but Paris is described one way there, but then another work, which will be the one that we read from, written by the Byzantine Greek chronicler from Antioch by the name of John Malalas, whose work is actually attributed to him around the 6th century AD, describes Paris as black-haired. The Trojan patriarch and father of Paris, King Priam of Troy's description is also very different, as he is described by John Malalas as ruddy-complexioned, but by the most likely 5th century work attributed to Dares the Phrygian as swarthy. So these descriptions are not to be taken too seriously, but they are interesting nonetheless, and will act as a segue into the last portion of this video, so we'll read a few of those right now. We'll go ahead and start with perhaps the main antagonist to the Achaean or Greek army in Homer's Iliad narrative, Hector of Troy. Hector, being the son of King Priam of Troy, leader of the Trojan forces and their best fighter overall, played arguably the most important role in the Iliad's narrative, up until the story's main protagonist, Achilles, decided to enter the war later on in the story after Hector participated in the killing of his great friend Patroclus. And so with Hector being such a central character to the Iliad story, it's only right to include his description in this sort of montage. So let's see how he was described, and again, we're going to get most of the descriptions from John Malala's account, because his is the only one out of the two that we know was actually written by him, and he also wrote in the Greek language, which is closer to the language that Homer wrote in, whereas the work attributed to Dares the Phrygian was written in the Latin language, so we'll read his account, which was entitled the Chronographica, or Chronography. So let's read his description of Hector of Troy, which is dark-skinned, tall, very stoutly built, strong, good nose, woolly-haired, good beard, squinting, speech defect, noble, fearsome warrior, deep-voiced. So we see the very familiar description of being dark-skinned and woolly-haired, but this time we see it in reference to a Trojan, and it actually echoes the description of Euripides in the Odyssey. But now going back over to the Greek side, I want to just go over a character who is mentioned relatively frequently throughout the Iliad, and was a semi-central figure who led the Greek forces as the king of the island of Crete. Now please, remember I said this particular character came from Crete because I'm going to show you guys something after I give this description. But let's first read the description given for the king in Crete at the time according to Homer, Idomeneus. So Idomeneus, above average height, dark-skinned, good eyes, well-set, strong, good nose, thick beard, good head, curly hair, a berserker. When fighting. So Idomeneus is described here as a man who again is dark-skinned with curly hair, which again echoes the description of Odysseus and Euripides. But I hope you kept in mind the fact that again, he was from the island in Greece known as Crete, because the people of Crete were oftentimes depicted by other cultures, and even depicted themselves as a people of color. One of the main groups of people at the time who portrayed the peoples that came from Crete were the Egyptians. They portrayed their likeness in a tomb dated to about the 18th dynastic period in Egypt, which would have been around CD 1550, 1292 BCE. This tomb is known as the Tomb of Rekimir, and inside the tomb, as was customary of ancient Egyptian burial practices, they painted murals for the person who would be crossing over into the afterlife. And on a certain wall of this tomb, it portrays tribute bearers from different parts of the world, from the Near East to, of course, Greece, bringing gifts for the Pharaoh of Egypt at the time, who I believe was Amenhotep II. But the peoples of Crete were portrayed on one of these murals, and they were depicted with a skin tone that was actually very similar to how the ancient Egyptians depicted Kushite Nubians, or as the Greeks would call them, Ethiopians, but also to how they depicted themselves. Remember, the ancient Egyptians were in fact described as black-skinned and woolly-haired by ancient Greek scholars who actually saw them in person, such as Herodotus. And this description of having black skin and being woolly-haired echoes the description that was given of the Ethiopians, who were again undoubtedly a Negroid people, so the ancient Egyptians would have been of that same physical appearance. So the fact that the people of Crete were portrayed looking like this, having a very what looks like a dark kind of reddish-brown skin complexion, in comparison to a Kushite, who, if we look at this image here, clearly is portrayed with pretty much the same skin color, or even to this image right here, where again the Kushites are portrayed with the same skin color, should tell us all we need to know about the inhabitants of Crete and what they looked like at the time. You could even compare the way the peoples of Crete looked to how the Egyptians depicted other lighter-skinned peoples, like how these Syrian gift-bearers are depicted here, and see that the dark skin color that was given to the peoples of Crete was intentional from the Egyptians. But this will be something I speak on in far greater depth when I get to the ancient civilizations of the world on this channel. One of those civilizations will of course be Greece, which I haven't really spoken about at length on this channel, in regards to the actual civilization of Greece, but rather just its mythology and stories, but I will get to that topic at a later date. But another Homeric character I want to take a brief look at before we move on to the last portion of this video is the character that comes from the Odyssey, known as Circe. Now, her description will not be given by John Malalas, as the other ones were. Rather, we are going to look at an ancient depiction of her that was painted on an actual vase from the Archaic period in Greece. And before we look at this vase, I just want to read a description that confirms how she is portrayed on this vase, so I am not accused of making any Afrocentric claims of my own. This is a book that was compiled by the prestigious Cambridge Philosophical Society, and we will read how they describe Circe on the vase we'll take a look at in a minute. So let's read this. With the Negroid Circe, on the vases is shown a hog as in Homer's story. So we see here it states that the Negroid Circe was depicted on an ancient Greek vase that was meant to portray her and how she looked. And the vase that this description is referring to is this one right here. Now we can see what the description from Cambridge's Philological Society was referring to when they stated Circe was Negroid. We can see the Negroid features clearly here, with the pronounced lips, the nose, and the tightly curled hair she is given here. Now this vase was made in Boeotia, which is a city in the area in Greece known as Thebes around the year 450 BC. And the figure who she is supposed to be standing next to is none other than Odysseus himself. Now, I'm not going to take it too far in saying that this vase outright depicts Odysseus according to exactly how we know him to have looked, which of course would have been a so-called black man. And the only reason why I'm saying that is because this form of Greek art is known as black figure pottery. And in this style of art, the figures who are usually portrayed on things such as vases or bowls or other ceramics are usually given a black skin color. But the thing is, this is usually something that is seen with men rather than with women. Men are usually the ones that are depicted black in this kind of art, but women are usually portrayed looking like this. And this brings me to the final point I want to address regarding the Odyssey and the controversy surrounding its newest adaptation to the big screen this summer. And that is the ever-present and seemingly undying vitriol towards the casting decision of the Homeric character known as Helen, the iconic beauty of ancient Greek mythological lore, who hailed from Sparta originally. But after her own consensual kidnapping by the Trojan prince Paris of Troy, aforementioned son of King Priam of Troy, she would be known famously as Helen of Troy. So now this controversy is actually quite hilarious to me, for a couple of reasons. Number 1, the vast majority of the people who are complaining about Helen of Troy being portrayed as a so-called black woman. For me, as someone who has read both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and has done an obviously copious amount of research on the two works to create this video, have never read either story, or perhaps have never even read or studied Greek classical literature ever in their lives. And I'm saying this not because of their outrage pertaining to how Helen is portrayed in the upcoming Christopher Nolan epic that will be coming out July 17th, but because they are complaining about a character that really and truly has very little impact on, I'd say, both stories. Now, of course, Helen of Troy is the main catalyst that sparks the decade-long Trojan War, with 1,000 Greek ships being discharged to go and retrieve the Spartan-born wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. But for those who have again read both the Odyssey and the Iliad, we know that she appears very few times in both narratives, only having about 7 or 8 appearances altogether between both stories. She appears 6 times in the Iliad, with the most time we get from her in Book 3, where she is summoned by King Priam to explain to him what the most notable Greek soldier's characteristics were, while her husband Menelaus, and the man whom she was having an affair with Paris, were about to engage in battle. And then her other appearances are found in Book 6 and Book 24, the very last of the books in the Iliad, but they are for very brief and fleeting moments. But in the Odyssey, she makes 2 appearances, in Books 4 and 15, and once again, they are very fleeting and have absolutely no impact on the overall story at all whatsoever. And some may say, well, why does this matter? It's still wrong to depict Helen of Troy in this way because she was obviously a white European woman who was described as a white European woman. And I wouldn't have a problem with that at all, in the slightest if, for number 1, people remained consistent with their outrage of allegedly white European characters being cast as anything else other than white European. So if that's the case, again, why get mad and outraged about the decision to cast Helen of Troy as black, but then only be semi-upset and outraged at Athena being cast as a black woman in the actress Zendaya? I have not heard anywhere near the vitriol and outrage hurled at Zendaya for her casting as Athena, a far more, and I do mean, far more impactful figure and character in both narratives of the Iliad and Odyssey than Helen ever was. Just in the first book of the Odyssey, where we see Athena not only inspire Zeus to allow Odysseus to return back home and reclaim his house and his wife from the 108 suitors who were trying to wed her, but also Odysseus' son Telemachus to go out and search for Odysseus to bring him home. So just in the very first book of the Odyssey, Athena has more impact on the overall narrative of the story than Helen ever does in both the Odyssey and the Iliad. So why people are not as outraged about that, at least from what I've seen from the videos on YouTube and TikTok to the articles online, I do not have the foggiest idea. But also other characters who are, again, far more essential to the story of the Odyssey, such as Eurylochus, second in command to Odysseus while he is trying to make his way home after the events of the Trojan War have occurred, are not being criticized to anywhere near the same degree as the casting choice of Helen of Troy being played by Lupita Nyong'o. Despite them being cast as something other than Caucasian Europeans, which, if we are going to be real about it, that is truly the problem. For most people who have a complaint, at least in my opinion, they don't really care one way or the other if the cast is filled with Greek actors or not. It's just the fact they are not Caucasian that's really the only gripe a lot of these people have. But another way in which I can tell that the vast majority of the people complaining about this casting choice of Helen being a so-called black woman rather than a very specific type of Caucasian European woman is because they do not understand or are able to put in proper context the language that was used to describe Helen of Troy in Homer's works. If one has been paying attention to the nonsensical rabblings of people complaining about a story that, again, in my opinion, they have never read themselves, or have done research on, or have even researched Greek mythology in general, you'll know that one of the main arguments people have used for the rejection of the casting choice for Helen of Troy is the fact that Homer describes Helen as being fair-haired and white-armed. These two epithets have fueled detractors in their attempts to try and completely shun the idea that Helen of Troy was anything but a blonde-haired, most likely blue-eyed, pale-skinned Caucasian European woman. But the thing is, despite how our modern-day interpretations of how to identify words when color is involved and it seems as though it is describing a person's literal appearance, this is not always the case. Now, on the other end, as to not be accused of sounding contradictory to the lengthy amount of time I spent proving that Odysseus was described in a way that indicates he was a so-called black man, Let me explain also that terms like white-armed were not literal descriptors of a woman's skin color, but rather, this was a colloquialism used not just by Homer, but other ancient Greek writers and poets to describe women who were of a certain level of nobility, femininity, and even divinity. But before I go too deep into that, I want to address the hair Helen was described having. In the Iliad, we actually do not get any specific, outright description of Helen of Troy's hair color. What people tend to do, however, is take the very frequently used term to describe Helen's hair, which is the Greek word kalikomos, which literally translates to fair-haired in most renditions you'll find of Homer's work. Now, I've seen a lot of people over the months since the announcement of the casting decision for Helen of Troy, who have attempted to cite her original description, go into the description and cite how she was called fair-haired, assuming that fair hair means what we would take it to mean today, which of course would be blonde or maybe red hair. But this is just not what the Greek word kalikomos means. Kalikomos was a Greek word that quite literally meant beautiful hair, with the Greek word kali meaning beautiful and komos meaning hair. So in all actuality, Homer in his plays, whenever he refers to Helen as being fair-haired, he is just simply saying she has beautiful hair. Not that she has blonde, red, or any other light-colored hair, so that can be dismissed, but the understanding most relatively modern scholars and even the public census of today have about Helen being blonde-haired, which have led to relatively modern depictions of her, such as these portraying her with a blonde or red hair color, come from later writers who described Helen's hair using a relatively well-known Greek term to describe the color of her hair. This Greek term, xanthi or xanthos, has been translated by most modern-day Greek classic scholars to mean mainly yellow. And I will be honest, the term xanthos does mean yellow. Yes, there is no denying that the ancient Greeks used this term to indicate a color that we would identify as yellow today. But the thing is, words and terms in the ancient world did not mean just one thing or have just one definition. Especially in the case of color terms, words could, and oftentimes did, have multiple different meanings. To understand this further, let's look back at the essay written by world-renowned Greek scholar and classicist Tim Whitmarsh. Tim Whitmarsh in his essay where he addresses a lot of the misconceptions people tend to have when reading ancient literature and the difficulties they have with identifying the language that was used by Homer in his poems. States here in this paragraph starting with Achilles was not a historical personage. We'll start off where it says Achilles is said in the Iliad to have xanthos hair. Achilles is said in the Iliad to have xanthos hair. This word is often translated as blonde, a translation that gives a powerful steer to the modern imagination. But translation can be deceptive. As Maria Michel-Sassi's essay for Aeon makes clear, the Greek color vocabulary simply doesn't map directly onto that of modern English. Xanthos could be used for things that we would call brown, ruddy, yellow, or golden. So Achilles was described in the Iliad as having xanthos hair, a word that again, most scholars of today at least will translate to be yellow, or in the case of hair, blonde. But as was stated earlier, words and the meanings of terms in the ancient world, especially pertaining to colors, could have multiple different definitions. Tim Whitmarsh helps us understand that the term xanthos could mean yellow, but it can also encompass what we call brown, as well as ruddy and golden. He expounds on this a couple of paragraphs down, stating, weirdly, some early Greek terms for color seem also to indicate intense movement. The same scholar points out that xanthos is etymologically connected to another word, xauthos, which indicates a rapid, vibrating movement. So while xanthos certainly suggests hair in the brown to fair range, the adjective also captures Achilles' famous swift-footedness and indeed his emotional volatility. So not only does xanthos encompass colors anywhere from, as he says, brown fair, but it also could indicate the movements of someone as well. He cites how xanthos was connected to a word that indicated intense movement, exuthos, and uses the example of Achilles having this word applied to him. So the nuance of words and how they were defined in the ancient world needs to be evaluated before people assume that a term like xanthos, especially when it is applied to something like hair, color means just strictly yellow. And as a matter of fact, an example we can use to understand this even further is the man who launched 1,000 ships to retrieve Helen from the Trojans himself, Menelaus. Menelaus is known for being the man who ended up marrying Helen after her earthly father Tyndareus chose him to marry her out of all the nobility and kings in Greece who wanted her hand in marriage. This arrangement also gave Menelaus the right to claim the kingship of Sparta after Tyndareus died, and Menelaus, being the essential character he is to the story of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, even though his role in the Odyssey is far smaller. He is mentioned a lot throughout, mainly the Iliad, and in the parts of the Odyssey where he is included, and one of the more common names Homer attributes to him is the title, the red-haired king. The term used for red-haired to describe Menelaus in this way is the exact same term we just looked at that is commonly rendered yellow by modern scholars of the Greek language. And as stated by Tim Whitmarsh, xanthous is a term that could encompass colors ranging from yellow to red to golden and then to brown. So red is definitely included in the definition of xanthous, but is it how Menelaus's hair would have looked according to Homer and his usage of this term? Well, we can look at an excerpt from a work that was produced by an Anglo-Irish historian, classical scholar by the name of John Bagnall Berry, who has this to say about the term xanthous and its meaning in relation to Menelaus. There is no reason to suppose that the Achaeans generally were fair-haired because Homer calls Menelaus xanthous, which means probably brown. So we see that according to this classical studies scholar, xanthous meant brown. And what's interesting is that brown is the only term that he defines xanthous to mean, not even including the possibility of it being yellow. Since, as he says, there is no reason to generally suppose that the Achaeans were generally fair-haired. This was something that was also pointed out by Harold Peake, a British archaeologist and anthropologist, who stated this in this work of his. Moreover, it has been pointed out that xanthous may only mean brown and that Menelaus had brown hair. So we see again the understanding that scholars have of the term xanthous may be meaning a brown color instead of just strictly a yellow color. But this account is admittedly a little unsure of this conclusion, so let's go ahead and look at something else that can give us a little more assurance. This is an excerpt that comes from the School of Classical Studies known as Smith College in the early 1900s. And Smith College, for those of you who don't know, is an institution dedicated to the study of ancient Greek and Roman civilization, and was founded in 1875. And in this work, written by one of their professors, Florence Elizabeth Wallace, she has this to say about the term xanthous and how it was applied specifically in Homeric works. As there was no word for tan or brown in Greek, it is not surprising that approximations like xanthous and the other Greek words that are listed are used. This a true fact. There were no specific Greek terms that were used for the color that we call brown today. So it would be understandable to use a term like xanthous, which was in close proximity to the meaning of brown at least, to indicate a brown kind of color, and an English classical scholar from the mid to late 1900s, who served as the vice-chancellor of the prestigious University of Oxford from 1951-1954, by the name of Cecil Maurice Bowra, can help double down on this notion. He says simply, xanthous means not so much blonde as brown. So again, there was an understanding amongst classical scholarship that xanthous did not just mean a yellow-blonde color, but could also encompass the color brown. And I just want to read one last excerpt to go along with everything I've read thus far, and it will come from an Italian anthropologist from the late 19th century, early 20th century by the name of Giuseppe Sergi, who was actually a very heavy advocate against Nordicism in his books on the racial identity of Mediterranean peoples. So his overall objective as a scholar during his lifetime was to oppose the narrative that a lot of scholars were trying to push during the 1800s and the early 1900s, which was that the ancient Greeks, particularly the Greeks of the Middle to Late Bronze Age, all the way to the Hellenic time period, were mostly blonde-haired and blue-eyed, due to them being Aryan interlopers in Greece and even Italy during its archaic period. So he's going to give us a relatively non-biased understanding of what the term xanthous meant. Achilles, however, is xanthos like Rhadamanthus, but xanthos means not only fair, but also chestnut, brown, and bees are xanthi. So now we should understand that xanthous is a term that not only encompassed the color yellow, and it wasn't just used to denote blonde hair, but it could mean brown hair as well, and probably meant brown hair more often than a lot of scholars and translators in our more immediate time period have let on. But that's not really fair of me to say, because there are some modern translators who have actually translated xanthous to encompass the brown color that it was capable of meaning. As Giuseppe Sergi states, The term xanthos could mean chestnut and brown along with fair, while the color chestnut is a reddish-brown type of color. And this was the color that was translated for Odysseus' hair actually, who Homer stated had xanthos hair in Book 13 of the Odyssey when Athena was transforming his appearance to that of a beggar. The well-known translator of both the Odyssey and the Iliad, who produced one of the best translations of both works since they've been translated to the English language. Our aforementioned reference Robert Fagles translated Odysseus's hair color as the color russet, which means a kind of dark reddish-brown color. As we can see here, it says from his translation, "She shriveled the supple skin on his lithe limbs, stripped the russet curls from his head." So the term xanthos did not, in fact, just mean yellow or blonde. And so, as this applies to Helen of Troy, and the image of her as a blonde woman, this belief of her being a blonde, Aryan-looking woman would not fit the overall image of how the ancient Greeks would have thought of her to have looked. Which is why xanthos, in reference to her hair color, did not necessarily mean that she was blonde or yellow-haired. She could have just as easily been brown-haired as well, since we know that was one of the definitions for xanthos. And I can say this on pretty good authority, because there is even visual evidence of Helen being a dark-haired woman. This is what is known as an ancient Greek red figure piece of artwork, which was a later type of art that stemmed from the Hellenic time period in 520 BC by the ancient Greek city of Athens. The woman that is portrayed here in the middle is in fact Helen of Troy, and she is clearly, unquestionably depicted here as dark-haired. Now, in my opinion, red figure art is not the most reliable form of Greek artwork, and I will explain why in a minute. But we can clearly see that Helen is depicted here as dark-haired, which would have been the standard hair color for any Greek or Mediterranean person at the time. And here is one more ancient depiction of Helen, this time from the other type of ancient Greek art that was mainly used on pottery, known as black figure art. And again, we see here that Helen is depicted as dark-haired, not blonde or light-haired. Now, don't make the mistake in thinking that this is due to the ancient Greeks not being able to portray more colors on their artwork. As we can see on Helen, there is a blackish red veil over her head, showing that they could have painted her hair a red color. And even in other pieces of black figure artwork, they had the capability of producing colors like brown and even yellow. So again, the ancient Greeks could have depicted Helen of Troy as fair-haired on these actual depictions from ancient times. Just like the more modern portrayals that oftentimes get propagated in the mainstream have taken the liberty in doing. But instead she is portrayed as dark-haired, so it should be understood that Helen of Troy was not in fact a fair, blonde, or even red-haired woman. But one more issue has to be dealt with, and I'm sure it's something that some of you watching may have noticed from the depictions of Helen I have shown thus far. And it's the fact that she is portrayed as pale white-skinned, which would, of course, fall in line with the description Homer gives of her being white-armed, a term that most have used to prove that she was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a pale-skinned woman. Well, this is not in fact the case, and I will explain why. So the reason why I stated the earlier art form known as red figure art was not the most reliable piece of artwork to go off of when evaluating how the ancient Greeks depicted themselves is because it does not portray the way in which the ancient Greeks showed the difference in appearance between men and women. But in this type of art the ancient Greeks produced, black figure art, they portrayed more closely how they would have depicted themselves. And I'm not going to get into my belief that red figure art is not an authentic Greek art style, because that will be for another day. But what I am going to do is explain what I mean when I state that black figure art is more accurate to how not only the Greeks would have depicted themselves, but also other civilizations that were living contemporary to them. The other major civilization of the Mediterranean outside of Greece were an archaic people from the country we know of today as Italy, the Etruscans. The Etruscans in their art depicted themselves the same way the ancient Greeks did, with males being portrayed as dark-skinned and females being given pale white skin. This was also very common with another European civilization's art style that was often involved with the Greeks and their affairs, whether it was war or trade among other things. They were a people who hailed from southeastern Europe, the Thracians, and in their art, once again, we can see that the males were oftentimes depicted with deep, dark reddish-brown skin to light reddish-brown skin, and the females were oftentimes depicted with white, pale skin. One last civilization that portrayed men as dark-skinned and women with pale, pretty much white skin were the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians very frequently depicted both the men and women in this style. An associate professor of classics and former chair of the Department of Classics at the University of Florida, Gainesville, by the name of Marianne Everly explains this best in her book, stating, "Most handbooks of ancient Greek art list Egypt as the inspiration for the use of male-female color differentiation in archaic Greek painting. An Egyptian source has been a consistent observation as early as Mary Hamilton Swindler, Ancient Painting, written in 1929. She observes that, among the earliest Greek paintings, sexes were early distinguished by color. This practice was probably derived from Egypt." She goes on to say, "The practice to which Swindler refers is the use of dark reddish paint for male flesh and a lighter color, either yellow or white for female flesh." She cites another scholar on this matter who says, "More than 50 years after, John Boardman followed the same path, noting in Athenian black figure vases, the male red, female white conventions of Egyptian art is generally indicated as the source for male-female color differentiation." So according to these scholars of ancient art from both ancient Greece and Egypt, the Greeks received their practice of painting the men dark and the women of a lighter color. And this was done, not so much to show them as literally being of that skin tone, but mainly to, as Mary Hamilton Swindler says, to distinguish the sexes by color. Another study was done on this particular topic by the Harvard Journal of Hellenic Studies, written in the early 1900s, and it has this to say about the phenomenon of ancient Greek art, imitating ancient Egyptian art by designating certain colors for males and females. The question is important in view of the famous reform in painting which Pliny attributes to Eurymus of Athens, who is said to have been the first to distinguish the sexes. On vases, it seems certain that this distinction was obtained at Corinth before it reached Athens. In early Corinthian vase painting, such as the Pnyx, the outline drawing is usually reserved for the flesh of women. If the Plinian story means anything, it may perhaps imply a somewhat fuller distinction, such as is found, for instance, on Egyptian wall paintings and papyri of the Middle Kingdom, where the women are tinted white and the men a rich brown. Skipping down a bit, the author of this journal also states, "The Egyptian conventions of flesh coloring are maintained ruddy brown for men and white for women." So both of these scholarly sources can help us understand that in the ancient world, men and women were designated by color, with men being depicted as dark-skinned and women as either yellowish or straight-up white. And so this understanding should now start to make a little bit more sense of why we see Helen being portrayed as white-skinned on these vases. But now the question begs to be asked, could this also explain why Helen is described by Homer as a woman who was white-armed? Well, the answer to that is it definitely is a start in understanding why this epithet was applied to her. But let's look a little bit deeper into why Homer uses this particular phrase to describe Helen of Troy and see if it truly was meant to imply that she was literally a white, pale-skinned woman. First off, in regards to the ancient Egyptians depicting themselves in their artwork with the color scheme of dark brown for men and the women being completely white or yellowish in color, is definitely not how they would have looked in their everyday society. The hot desert climate of Egypt itself would not have supported a pale-skinned color on a wide scale. So this depiction of women as pale white is most likely meant to be symbolic of femininity, especially since we know the ancient Egyptians were capable of properly portraying women in a way that is most likely more befitting to what they actually would have looked like skin color-wise. And we should already know from descriptions that were given of the ancient Egyptians by ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, who stated they, along with the Colchians, were black-skinned and woolly-haired. Also, Aeschylus, the Greek poet, stated the Egyptian sailors he saw had black limbs, and even Aristotle stated that the Egyptians were regarded as having too black a hue, along with the Ethiopians. So we know how the Egyptians looked according to the ancient sources, which would contradict the appearance of any of them, even their women, being actually pale-skinned. This is the same for ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks oftentimes would depict women and even describe them in their ancient texts or stories as white to emphasize their feminine nature. The idea was that since women were not outside as much as men and were expected to perform the duties of the household, i.e., stay inside more, that they would usually be portrayed as white to indicate them being lighter in skin complexion than men, but not literally all the way pale. Tim Whitmarsh states this about the whiteness of females and what it symbolized in ancient Greece. Black melas and white lukos are also, importantly, gendered terms. Females are praised for being white-armed, but men never are. This differentiation finds its way into the conventions of Greek and indeed Egyptian art, too, where we find women often depicted as much lighter of skin than men. To call a Greek man white was to call him effeminate. So Whitmarsh helps us understand that whiteness signified femininity by stating the terms white and black were gendered words and that they applied only to women but never to men, at least not to men of Greek descent, and then b. That to actually call a man white was to state that he was effeminate, which further ties femininity to whiteness for ancient Greece. An example of this can be viewed from the statements made by the ancient Greek historian and military leader Xenophon, who documented the complexion of the Persians Greece was at war with at the time as being white in color, stating, thus the Persian soldiers, seeing that these men are white-skinned because they were never without their clothing, and soft and unused to toil because they always rode in carriages, came to the conclusion that the war with them would be in no way different from having to fight women. Another example of how the ancient Greeks thought of whiteness as a symbolic color of femininity can be seen by looking at the statements given by Aristotle in his work, Physiognomics, who stated, "Those whose skin is too dark are cowardly. Witness Egyptians and the Ethiopians. Those whose skin is too light are equally cowardly. Witness women. The skin color typical of the courageous should be halfway between the two." So once again, the ancient Greeks associated having a white skin tone with effeminacy and the nature of women, which is why at almost every turn they decided to portray their women with this skin color. But what needs to be kept in mind is that this was mainly symbolic and not indicative of literal physical appearance. This is also why, according to Tim Whitmarsh, men were never called white-armed or referred to as white during the Archaic period in ancient Greece. The color white was not just a term that denoted the feminine nature of women by the ancient Greeks, it also was used to denote the divinity of a female goddess's figure, or even a woman who was said to be descended from one of the gods of Olympus, through their very frequent interactions with women on the earth. Plato in his Republic illustrates this understanding best, stating, "The white are children of the gods, divinely fair." So the color white could also indicate the divine nature of a person, mainly a woman, and this without a doubt applies to Helen of Troy, as she was said to be the child of Zeus, who transformed himself into a swan and seduced her mother Leda, resulting in Helen being hatched from an egg. So Helen was one of the, as Plato would say, children of the gods, which most likely is what made her a divinely fair or beautiful woman. This sentiment is expounded upon more by the Sussex-based writer and academic, who received her PhD in classical studies for her thesis on viewer reception of Greek mythology by the name of Amanda Potter. She partnered with another academic, scholar and associate professor of history at Western Michigan University, Anise K. Potter. In this book, they explain how color terms in the ancient world, as they were written in classical writings, did not mean how we perceive them today, and how specifically in the case of Helen of Troy, she was called white, or white-armed, to indicate her divine nature as they thought it to be, which came through her beauty as well as her relation to the greatest of the Greek gods, Zeus. So we will read this whole paragraph, which is a bit lengthy but necessary to look at. Helen is often assumed to be racially white. She is Greek, and Greekness is often aligned with whiteness. Although the ancient Greeks may not have distinguished between different racial categories based on skin color, the assumption is often made that ancient Greeks and by default Helen were white because they are not described otherwise. For many people, especially the non-classicist who is not attuned to the intricacies of translation and Homeric epithets, the fact that Helen has been consistently represented as white in art and film, combined with the epithet leukolinos, white-armed, supports this assumption. After all, if she is literally described as white-armed, doesn't that mean her arms and skin are, well, white? The translation of Leukolinos as white-armed, however, is a misleading one, as we can see when we look more closely at how the word is used. This is a generic epithet, which is used to refer to many women, goddesses, mortals, and even enslaved women, such as maids of Odysseus's household. Leukolinos, like all the adjectives used by Homer to describe Helen, is a generic epithet that is often, but not always, used to indicate some type of divinity. The leuko root can mean white as in leukocyte or white blood cell, but it can also mean shining. Leukolinos might better be translated as shining-armed, a word that does not have any racial implications. Goddesses and semi-divine mortals, like Helen and Nausicaa, are marked for their shining appearance, and right there is where we will stop. But we see the authors of this book give us a pretty good understanding of how white-armed was used in relation to not just Helen, but also other characters in Homeric poems. The authors of this work reference how the maids of Odysseus and even the daughter of the king and queen of an island kingdom Homer calls Phaeacia, Nausicaa, were called white-armed as well. So this is clearly not just an epithet that applied to Helen of Troy, but it was, as Amanda Potter and Anise K. Strong state in this book, a generic epithet that indicated often, but not always, the divinity of someone. The aforementioned princess of the kingdom of Phaeacia, Nausicaa, was of a divine lineage herself, descending from the sea and earthquake god Poseidon. He was a paternal ancestor of both of Nausicaa's parents, who were King Alcinous and Queen Arete. Coincidentally enough, Queen Arete was also called white-armed in Book 7 of the Odyssey, which reinforces that this epithet of white-armed applied to other women besides Helen. And probably the main figure we see this term applied to in Homer's works is the mother goddess and consort of Zeus, Hera. The goddess's Hera is called white-armed 24 times by Homer in the Iliad alone, which is far more than the handful of times he calls Helen of Troy white-armed in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. But this term white-armed, as it is applied to Hera by Homer, is not even the only time she is ever called white-armed. The term white-armed was used by a multitude of different ancient Greek writers and poets as a generic epithet for Hera. The contemporary poet to Homer, Hesiod, refers to Hera as white-armed in his work Theogony. The 5th century BC poet Pindar referred to Hera as white-armed in his Pythian Odes Third. The ancient Greek poet, also of the 5th century BC, Bacchylides, calls Hera white-armed in his Fragment 9 work that is available to us, states, "The luxuriant ground of Nemean. Zeus, where white-armed Hera nurtured the sheep-killing deep-voiced lion, first of Heracles' glorious contests. There was even a ring found in the ancient Greek city of Argolid, dated to the early 6th century BC, which has an inscription that lets us know that this was a common epithet for the mother goddess's Hera. The inscription states, Heracnitus dedicated this to the goddess white-armed Hera. So we should have it firmly embedded in our understanding that white-armed, for number one, did not just specifically refer to Helen as a way to describe her as pale-skinned. It was a term that referred to a multitude of different female characters, both mortal and immortal, and existed as a common and generic term to indicate divinity, femininity, or beauty. But just sticking to the understanding of its illustration of divine goddess figures in ancient Greek mythological lore, there were a bevy of other female figures who were also called white-armed besides the one we have already gone over. Going right back to the 5th century BC poet Pindar, he calls the goddess of harmony and concord, Harmonia, white-armed Harmonia. Her being a goddess means she was divine, and we should know that the term white-armed also had to do with divinity and an immortal or mortal woman, i.e. Helen being known as divine. He also states the daughter of the Phoenician founder of Boeotia Thebes, Cadmus, who was known as Semele or Thyone, was white-armed in his Pythian Odes the Three. Going back to the 5th century poet Bacchylides, he refers to many women in his fragmented works that are still available to us today as white-armed. One of which is the mortal woman Iole, who was highly coveted by the legendary Greek hero Heracles, who wanted her hand in marriage. Now, although she was mortal, she was still of divine lineage through her father, who was Eurytus of Oechalia and a grandson of the sun and archer god Apollo. He calls the daughter of Phoenician prince Phoenix white-armed, and this daughter of Phoenix would have also been a mortal woman of divine lineage, since Phoenix, who was a son of the Phoenician king Agenor, descended from Poseidon through his father, making him divine, and his daughter, whom Bacchylides calls white-armed, divine as well, which echoes the sentiments put forth by Plato we have read of the children of the gods being white and divinely fair. Bacchylides calls one of the divine muses that ancient Greek poets believed gave them the inspiration to write their poems by the name of Calliope, white-armed as well, again, affirming that this term white-armed referred to women of divinity, which could be the genesis behind why the Greek term for white, leukos, can be translated as not just white but also bright and shining, indicating the bright and shining radiance of a divine figure. And this can be affirmed by taking a look at one last divine goddess's figure Bacchylides refers to as white-armed. He calls the mother goddesses Artemis the white-armed as well. Now keep in mind what Artemis is the goddess of, according to what the ancient Greeks believed: the hunt, nature, wild animals, the wilderness, vegetation, among other things. The hunt or hunting, that is an activity that is associated with being outside. So is the wilderness, being a literal outside setting. So are wild animals, who have always been found outside. Vegetation, or the growth of plants, cannot happen without outside influence, and of course nature is the very essence of outside. Keeping all of this in mind, we can refer back to earlier, at the very beginning of our examination of Helen's skin color, where it was stated that the ancient Greeks would oftentimes paint their women white to indicate their role as the ones who tended to the duties of the household, i.e. staying inside. The American classic scholar explains this in his book, where he states, in earlier Greek vase painting, white paint primarily denotes sex distinctions, a practice shared by the Egyptians and Romans in their respective iconographic traditions. The use of white reflects Greek cultural ideology that women's proper sphere is indoors, cloistered within the house. So the idea that women were regarded as white, regardless of whether they were slaves, like the maidens of Odysseus's wife Penelope, free, noble, such as the princess of Phaeacia Nausicaa and her mother Arete, or even the wife of Hector, of Troy from the Iliad, Andromache, who were all called white-armed. And also mortal or immortal women were oftentimes called white, partially due to them being associated with the indoors. But oddly, this epithet of white-armed is associated with a goddess who is known for being the goddess of things that primarily have to do with the outdoors. So in theory, Artemis should not have had this term applied to her if the epithet of white-armed was literally describing her as pale-skinned. So the only conclusion we can come to is that this term white-armed was not literally meant to describe a woman as pale or white in complexion, but rather it was a term that was meant to emphasize the femininity, beauty, or divinity of the woman being described. All of those components are what make up the description we are given of Helen of Troy. So here's the final question. Was Helen a so-called Caucasian woman with pale skin and blonde hair? No, most likely not. Now, was she a Mediterranean-looking woman with possibly black hair, which would be more probable, and olive or tanned skin? That's possible. But was she a black woman? Could she have been a black woman? Who knows, regardless of what people might not want to hear or what people may think. We don't have an actual true-to-life description of Helen in any of Homer's works. What we know of her appearance is that she was beautiful, she had beautiful hair, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So it is not for me to say if Helen was black or not, but it is also not for people to make uneducated assumptions about Helen and her appearance based on interpretations of ancient phrases from over 2,000 years ago, who lived in a totally different world and spoke a totally different language that most who are commenting on Helen of Troy's appearance on social media and beyond do not know at all. But my last statement will actually be a few questions. And those questions are, if you are outraged and offended at the alleged race swapping that has been with the upcoming Odyssey movie, with Black, Hispanic, and Asian actors playing the roles of European figures, will you keep that same energy? After learning that Odysseus, the main character of this entire epic work, who was described as a man that had black skin and woolly hair, a description that comes from the man who wrote the story himself and matches the description of many Negroid peoples that lived in the ancient world at the time? Is it okay for people like myself to be upset with him not being cast as a black man? Or even as Harold Euripides, who I don't even know if he'll be in the movie or not. But assuming he is and is not cast as a black man, just as he was described by, again, the man who wrote the Odyssey poem. Because if we are going for historical accuracy, we should be as accurate as possible, right?